Hi, and welcome to Contercast. My name's Kat Boyd. I'm joined as ever with my lovely co-host, David Jameson.
I'm doing good before you ask. Exhausted after a week of US politics.
Yeah, I was just saying there that my body clock is really out of sync with the realities of day-to-day life in Scotland because I've just shifted myself onto, what was it, West Coast time, Jodi?
Yeah, that's what I was guessing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. So we have a very special guest on the podcast today. We're joined with Professor Jodi Dean, who's an activist and author. Jodi did one of the Conter lectures that we ran the series of during lockdown. And she's the author or editor of 12 books, including Democracy and Other Neoliberal Fantasies, Blog Theory, The Communist Horizon, and Crowds and Party. She's also the author of a piece that's very, very close to my heart that I enjoy a lot, which is called Comrade. The recording of Jodi's lecture that she did during lockdown is available on our YouTube channel, should anyone want to check that out. But obviously, Jodi's joining us tonight to talk about the US election. And my brain is a bit frazzled on it all. So I'm just going to, just for any listeners, I want to put this in the context of what time and day we're recording this. So this is Friday the 6th, just after 7:30. And at my last check, and when I looked at the news update on the BBC, it was Biden was gaining a lead in Nevada and Pennsylvania and is on 264 electoral college votes to Trump's 214. Am I still right with that?
In some ways, I think it might depend on which, like what exactly you're checking, because my last check, AP and the New York Times were still saying Biden 253 because they hadn't given him Arizona. And so there's been a little bit of back and forth. In fact, one American news outlet has already said that he's won. So the exact count of expected electoral college votes is not 100% clear.
I mean, it keeps us on our toes, right?
Whatever scale you're using, this is out of date by the time you're watching it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So I mean, given that that's kind of the state of play as we generally understand it at this current point, what meaning does this election, do you think, does it have at this point? Because particularly early on, when the votes were coming in, you could see that that Biden was kind of underwhelming, at least in the sense that Trump was clearly doing better than many people had forecast. And I still think that's, you can see, for example, that Trump has expanded his coalition. He's grown his vote. A lot of people would have been surprised by that. On the other hand, there's an even more huge vote for Biden, and I'm sure that his outriders in the media are making much of a so-called blue wave and so on. I mean, are we seeing that kind of return of the center, or is the picture just one of polarization in general? What's the kind of general takeaway from how this vote worked out?
I think it's one of intense polarization, and the reason I think that it's one of intense polarization is how bad the polling was and predicting the election, right? Failing to see the amount of support that was out there for Trump. I mean, it's not been a blue wave. I mean, if it was a blue wave, it would have been clear on election night. It wouldn't have, and it wouldn't be within the margin of error, like in the margin of error in Georgia. Georgia's already said that they're going to have to do a recount because it's so close, and that's without a legal challenge, right? It's just within that margin where recounts in order. So I think it demonstrates intense polarization, and to be honest, a real failure on the part of the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party could not beat someone who's killed 230,000 Americans with the worst COVID response in the entire world. mean, they couldn't defeat someone who separated children from their families at the border and had over 500 children just a month ago who they couldn't find their parents. Right? Somebody who takes babies from their mother. They couldn't defeat that guy. They couldn't defeat a guy who everyone knows is involved in all sorts of legal battles around essentially corrupt real estate deals and tax problems. So that's a huge failure on the part of the Democrats. And in fact, the rest of the down, I mean, not all of it, but much of the down ballot election shows you that it's the Democrat failure. They didn't flip any seats in the House. In fact, they lost a bunch. I think they lost at least 8. I may be wrong on that number, but which is also changing. Does not look like they're going to take the Senate. If they do, I think at best they can tie, but they may not even do that. So the Democrats actually are coming out of this hobbled and weak. And some will try to say, oh, well, because Biden won the popular vote, this is something like a mandate and this is a strength of going back to normal. I don't think we should fall for that at all, right? This is a very weak candidate who, may have just crossed over the finish line because of people's general exhaustion and fear and sickness.
I mean, I can agree more with that. Like, I think that when I was watching like the initial results coming in, the idea that Biden and his campaign couldn't smash the most incompetent president in American history, and that to me should it should present certain arguments and it should put the Democrats in a position to try and learn lessons. But I don't think that that's what's going to happen at all. Biden's presidency, should he become president, but that's the kind of indications right now. Being hobbled and weak, I don't think that there's going to be the lesson that maybe the three of us would like the Democrats to learn will be learned. And instead, I think that there's going to start being, and I've already seen some of this on Twitter, the blame is going to be laid with a lot of the leftist elements, the more progressive parts of the Democratic Party, and I'm already seeing that starting to happen. Is that something that you've picked up on?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Kat. I was just reading an article that was reporting on a call with a bunch of members of Democratic members of Congress, and there was, I don't remember what her name was, but there's a mainstream member of Congress who was just trashing progressives and saying, if there's one more call for defund the police, the Democratic Party will go down in flames. You all calling for defunding the police cost the election, and you're, the ones who've doomed the party, and all sorts of like crazy, like really hardcore anti-protest. I honestly think there's that it's racist because that's the representation of all of the summer struggles as just defund the police, when they were actually struggles for justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Daniel Prude, and so many others who've been murdered by aggressive, racist, militarist police in this country. So I think that, instead of the Democratic Party saying, oh my God, leftists, we're sorry we've run such lame middle of the road candidates, and who, at a time when people really want to see fundamental change, and we're going to try to do best, and we do want to expand to Medicare for all, and we do want to have a Green New Deal. We're all together. Instead, they're going to be like, see a progressives, our new alliances with the middle of the Republican Party.
So I know we're still quite early on in the podcast, and I don't want to like start hitting out with my devil's advocate sort of points, because I actually do want to explore some of this, because I was wondering if maybe there was an element of truth to the fact that some of the more, can I say, careerist elements of the progressive left who came like on the second wave of Bernie, and the pull that they have had, like with identity politics. I don't mean necessarily about Black Lives Matter, but more on things like feminism, trans rights, and pushing them to the front of the campaign. Do you think that there's an element of truth that that didn't resonate with the electorate?
Um, I don't know, right? There was quite a few victories for candidates running more identity-based campaigns. There are also for the New York State legislature, there were some victories from people who were running from the Democratic Socialist of America. So a combination of a socialist and a sort of more identity appeals. I I don't think that was a losing strategy. I think that the more of the losing strategy was figuring out for people who really had conservative districts how to stand up and defend something. I mean, honestly, the Democratic Party's position was not defund the police ever. And if you can't say that, like then you actually don't know how to speak like a politician. That said, I don't want to deny opportunism among new Democrats. I think that's clear. I mean, if someone's going to pursue that kind of electoral politics, almost by definition, they're going to be some version of an opportunist.
I thought it was interesting that during the Biden's campaign, so there's a way to argue against right-wing talking points that isn't a sort of like Marxist or socialist way. So, for example, Trump obviously made this campaign about, and I thought it was a weak argument on his part. In 2016, he did a very good job of presenting himself as the anti-elite candidate. Whereas in this election, this is the other thing, I don't even think he had a particularly good campaign. But he made much more of the sort of Biden's a secret communist stuff, which, it's not very convincing. It's quite a niche subcultural argument. But Biden's response to that was never to say, if you're calling, improved healthcare socialism, it shows how much contempt you have for people in this country. But he never said that. When he was accused of being a socialist, he said, I'm the guy who beat the socialists, right? Which is a very weak response, but it does, I think, indicate that, this idea of, I think Biden was always going to attack the left. I think if Biden had had an absolute landslide and Trump's support had collapsed, he'd have turned on the left. This was always part of the plan, does that make things more difficult on the left that you have a very obvious internal struggle?
I think at this point it starts to become, the issue starts to become, how are we thinking about the left, right? Is the left of the Democratic Party and those who take the Democratic Party as the field of operation, or is the left those outside the Democratic Party? And I would say I think of the left as those outside the Democratic Party, right? Whether or not we're talking about movements or the smaller revolutionary parties, at least half of DSA would be more, a little bit more exterior to the Democratic Party. And so, it just because, I think you can't answer your question without kind of dividing it up. And so for everybody who thinks that the Democratic Party is a capitalist party protecting capitalist masters and capitalist interest, no surprise, doesn't make things worse, better, or anything. Like we've known for, at the very least since Clinton's Clinton cut the working class out of the Democratic Party, right? That way, and shifted the whole orientation towards Wall Street. So the US just has two capitalist parties. We don't have a real opposition party. And in some ways, Biden making this clear is useful. You could think of like the kind of pause or interregnum was Obama, where people, because of just the intense racism of the US, it seemed like such an important opening and it's such an important possibility for real change. And things like became it seemed different for the left. But if we think about the left in terms of working class and workers' issues, then it was never that, right? It was always a more diverse elite, not a expansion of the possibilities for working class interests to get a hold on it within the US political system.
No, I think that's interesting. And I suppose we'll have to watch how that unfolds in terms of how the left faces Biden if he is indeed going to form the next presidency. But I wanted to ask next about the other side and about what Trump is doing and how, why is he resisting in this way? Is this really about him trying to hold on to the election? Is that a real objective for him, or is he trying to just build a movement that extends his influence into the kind of post-election period?
Yeah, can I just come in on like what David is saying there? Because when I've been looking at Twitter today, just to, increase my own blood pressure, there's a lot of people who are, this kind of like Trump as a toddler, Trump is like a child, he's behaving unpresidential again, and this was a great reason to get rid of him in the first place. But there's this real kind of like laughing at him and that he's just having a tantrum. But I think that underneath it, there's something very sinister and very dangerous happening here. And I don't think that Trump is necessarily an idiot. I think he knows exactly what he's doing.
I'll tell you, the one thing I think the real benefit of Biden's win is going to be that we all don't have to talk about Trump every day for the next 4 years, because it's since his campaign 5 years ago took off, he's dominated all of our thinking and feeling and mental space. I guess I take the view that Trump's world is just about him and his his appetites, his ego, his am I winning, am I losing, am I loved, am I not loved, right? Just like this the kind of sort of pathetic person who needs to be on stage all the time and being he had to do the rallies, right? He had to do all these big rallies in the time of COVID. He had to appear at the White House after he returns from the hospital, and whip off his mask. He always has to have an audience. And I think that this is not, I don't think he's having a political strategy that makes any sense. I think that he is trying to not be a loser, because that would be bad. And the only way he could possibly lose is if he was being, some people were stealing from him, and then making sure that people agree with him and still love him. So I think that, I don't think he's strategic enough to be a movement person. I think that earlier it was Steve Bannon, at the beginning of his administration, his campaign, who was the movement person. I don't think the Trump kids are movement people. I think that they're just sort of, relatively not bright, sort of entitled celebrity kids. And so I don't see a strategy there. I think the yes men around Trump, we'll keep on with saying, okay, we can try this, we can try that. I think Giuliani, the lawyer, who's great in the Borat movie, by the way, just great. I think Giuliani may be really at his core a fascist, right? A hardcore law and order, as long as law is what he wants, right? The kind of, sliding around law is just an instrument of his own sadism. I think Giuliani might want to use this strategically, but I don't think that's part of Trump's interior makeup.
That's interesting, because I kind of assumed that I sort of agree with you. Part of the problem with American politics these days is you're always asking questions about Trump's psychology. What is his motivation in this situation? That's always true. Psychology always matters in politics, but there's rarely a time when the sort of deranged psychology of one individual matters so much. But I think whether it's coming from a place of strategy or whether it's coming from a place of egotism, I think it does actually help Trump potentially in a number of ways. It could backfire. But I also do think he's putting the Republican Party in a difficult position. I mean, when I sort of was telling myself there's a serious chance that Biden just wipes Trump away here, I thought to myself, well, that means Trump is gone, and it means that the Republicans then have a radicalized base with no charismatic leader. which is a terrible place for the Republican Party to be. And I thought, they're in real trouble now. And whereas in 2016, when there was quite a lot of Republican resistance to Trump, by 2020, there was basically none. Even people like Marco Rubio, supposedly moderate figures in the party, were just going on his campaign trail and making speeches for wonderful President Trump. So I thought, they could be in real trouble now, trying to re-establish a kind of, less complicated, less populist Republican Party. Now I think they're in real trouble because that base is so radicalized. Trump is continuing to radicalize it. He's continuing to deepen that radicalization. What can the traditional, the establishment Republican leadership do about this situation? Is it even possible that they get dragged to the right by this process? Because that was certainly the case with the Tea Party. I mean, everyone's fawning over John McCain at the moment, but it was him who introduced Sarah Palin. And help to radicalize the Republican base. So, what happens to them with all this going on?
I think those are really interesting questions, for us to think about. Okay, the first thing I've been really surprised since Tuesday about how minimal the protests have been. And I mean, and part of me, part of me was like thinking by Wednesday morning, I was thinking it must just be the case that the big social media giants like Facebook and Twitter are not giving us the news about this because they want to kind of keep it on the DL so as not to incite some kind of real like crisis, right? Like it's like a kind of, crisis intervention, prevent it from becoming civil war or something. Because I think most people expected things to be utterly chaotic starting Tuesday, right? Expected armed militias at voting booths. I mean, even in the week before, there were reports in multiple places of Trump supporting caravans driving through primarily Black and brown neighborhoods in order to exert a kind of intimidation on voters there. And yet Tuesday went with, in fact, fewer stories of voter intimidation in election places than in a more typical U.S. election. So, and then in the last couple of days, yes, there's been some protests, but they've been relatively small, particularly compared to like all the protests from the summer. And so this has made me start to wonder, all right, how radicalized is Trump's base? It's totally clear that the country's polarized, right? I like looking at exit polls. I mean, maybe they're no better than any other polls, but whatever, it's some sort of data. And the exit polls were just sort of crazy. Like people who voted for Trump, like, I don't know, like some crazy amount, let's say 80%, it could be like 76, it could have been 92, but in that ballpark, thought he did an okay job or a good job handling the coronavirus. Like, that's just crazy. Then the people who voted for Biden thought Trump did a terrible job with the coronavirus. And then people who wanted a strong leader voted, completely highly, like 90% of those people voted for Trump. People who wanted, national unity, 90% of them voted for Biden. So you saw intense polarization. Really, and there are a bunch of other indicators that were on these sort of issues where people were really polarized. And so that seems really clear. But I'm not sure that that people are radicalized in the same way. And I'm not we may not know that. Like there may not have been an expansion or an intensification of or radicalization of his base. So we've got polarization, but maybe not so much radicalization. If by radicalization we mean, really going out in the streets with the guns. I mean, we thought earlier in the summer you had people with guns like going into the Michigan State House. Later on, like last month, they were going to kidnap the governor. So we've seen a fair amount of organized white supremacist groups doing stuff, but they haven't been doing that in the last few days. So is that going to expand? or not. And so I actually think it's a question on the radicalization part, and I'll be interested to see what happens. So that's the first thing. On the Republican Party's part, I've already been wrong on this within the last 24 hours. So, because on Wednesday, after Trump had made his, early morning, well, I'm, clearly winning. If we, I've won. We should, just declare this, or whatever he said early in the morning. No Republican no Republican elected leaders backed him up or said anything. They were really like Chris Christie, who's the former governor of New Jersey. He was kind of a Trump man. He was not supporting that. And you didn't get any real support there. And so I was thinking, okay, so the Republican leadership is not standing by him. That's changed, though, now in the last 24 hours, even after yesterday's crazy, or last night's crazy speech, where Lindsey Graham from South Carolina has been all in for Trump, and a few others have been all in, and they're repeating the, oh, it's really crucial to they're repeating not just we've got to, count the legal votes, which is that's what an election is. They're going off with the yes, there's numerous cases of fraud. This is being stolen. The Democrats are doing this. It's corrupt, blah, blah, blah. So I think that seeing how much of the Republican Party leadership goes hardcore on this Trump stolen election stuff, that's going to be really crucial. And that part I think is still unfolding. So but I think that's separate from the radical base question.
I did wonder that this result might be worse in some ways for the centrists within the Republican Party than for centrist Democrats, because I no matter like what the outcome is for Trump, I think it's really impossible to draw a line under Trump's populist era. And for the Democrats, they can and they will, as we've said, blame their poor performance on the kind of the kind of ID politics, careerists as they might present it. But I think it's going to be much harder for centrist Republicans to gain any sort of traction back, to gain any sort of messaging back to a particular base.
Yeah, I think that's right, Kat. And the way I would put it, though, is that the centrist Republicans have already been totally eclipsed, right? When they cooperated with the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court with less than a month before the election, that was a real sign of essentially just they're only acting in a partisan way. They're not acting in a way that is, I don't know, the mainstream likes to say they're not acting in terms of normal politics, but they're not acting as moderates, right? They let the most extreme elements of the Republican Party dictate how they act. So moderate Republicans have exercised no guidance or leadership in the Republican Party for quite a while now. So, I mean, it's almost like we don't have a working class party. We have two capitalist parties, a party that of a kind of extreme right, or that's only pushed by the extreme right, and a party that's really, say the kind of party of neoliberalism and the professional managerial class. So it's like, those elements of the ruling class.
Can I ask about the kind of, I was about to say the international impact of this, but it's kind of internal as well, right? What does this election represent in terms of the longer term decline of American hegemony? So obviously, people can overstate this. America is still by far the most powerful state on earth, the wealthiest, and so on. But this does feel like a bit of a moment. And although I remember people saying this about George Bush's first election, with the hanging chads and so on, this has made a fool of America's claims to be this hyper-democratic beacon to the world. But I think in many ways this will be worse, that you have Trump holding on in this way, making all kinds of claims. The president claiming that his country is not effectively democratic. It is a bit of a moment. what does that do to kind of American kind of imperial ideology, both at home and abroad? And I ask that because it strikes me as well that it would be difficult just to look at the division you've talked about between those two parties of capital and say, again, I think sometimes people out of America kind of falsely imagine this, that the Republicans are the imperialist party, though they are an imperialist party, you know, but there's a sense in which some of the elements that Trump has gathered into his coalition are people who feel disenchanted. They're not necessarily the most kind of like, make America the kind of return it to kind of global empire that sticks its finger into every pie and all this kind of stuff. I think that's a kind of wrong conception. So, what does this do to like imperial ideology in America?
So if first thing, I'm going to look at two kind of bases for U.S. imperialism. One is clearly the military power, and the U.S. still has that nuclear weapons and military bases. Like in 180 countries, so that's there, and that's dangerous. And also for a declining hegemon to have that much military power is also dangerous. Next thing is then U.S. economic power. I was just reading something today that was saying that China has actually experienced it was its second quarter economic growth, productivity growth, like over 3%, maybe 3.5, maybe I'm dyslexic on this 5.3, but some like serious growth, even with coronavirus, because they got it under control. And the U.S. has, of course, declined dramatically. And so there's like an 8 to 9 point spread between how much China has grown and how much we've declined. U.S. economic power in the near term looks to be quite secondary and diminished. And that I think is going to get increasingly severe. So if we think about, so we've got those two things in play, and then you have the policies, and the Democrats are almost always more imperialist in terms of getting involved in foreign wars, thinking that they want to swing America's big, swinging morality and use that to penetrate other countries all the time. So I think that is that's still likely. So full stop. And then the next thing, you said earlier, David, something like the election wasn't, Trump didn't have any issues out there. I mean, there were almost no issues in the election. I'll talk about the one a little bit later, but I think there were no foreign policy issues because there's too much agreement at this point. So it's not going to be the case, like the Democrats aren't going to try to change the capital of Israel back to Tel Aviv, right? They will be happy with it in Jerusalem. They were racing the Republicans to see who could be most anti-China. And for quite a while, they've been more anti-Russia than the Republicans have. So I don't see, and with respect to Latin America, the Democrats have the same kinds of kind of anti-socialist attitudes towards the countries in Latin America. So I don't see, so overall, I mean, I guess I just see our continued decline, maybe a little bit slower. A lot, I think, is going to depend on Europe. And is Europe going to kind of give a pass to the US and say, okay, we're just glad, that you've got a normal politician back. And so let's play our regular game. Let's get back, and reestablish our relations. Or are they going to be like, you guys are too risky. The Trump stuff was too awful. We don't need you. We'll do our own things at this point. I think a lot more depends on Europe at that point.
I think I totally agree with that. When I was watching the coverage the other night, and one of the pundits was talking about that one of Biden's priorities as president would be to begin restoring good international relationships, and begin to, restore NATO, essentially, which is definitely, like, particularly within Scotland, has become one of the key battlegrounds in the independence movement over an independent Scotland's membership of NATO. or not. Obviously, the main nationalist party, the SNP, would want an independent Scotland in NATO, but I do think that the Biden presidency and the attitude towards NATO and how that changes is going to be even more important for people in Scotland to begin making the arguments about what NATO is. Like, it's the relationship between the US and Europe and how that is solidified around NATO and nuclear weapons. I think one of the main international issues that ties into some of the political discussions that we've been having recently on not just the podcast, but in the left more generally, in the UK, is around Palestine and Palestine solidarity. Because regardless of the Trump presidency or a Biden presidency, they're both pro-Zionist, pro-apartheid, pro-IDF. Like, and I'd seen this point made on Twitter, but not in, it wasn't widespread, but there were certainly good news outlets putting this forward. And as you say, Biden's not going to, reverse any of the decisions that Trump made. But I think that there are big questions to be asked about what happens in the Middle East with a Biden presidency, and how do the left respond to that? Now, what really worries me is that in the UK, we've had the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party, after the anti-Semitism report, and all of that does come down to discussions about the Israeli state, about the nature of Britain and America's adventures in the Middle East, I feel like the left, particularly in the UK, are really losing the argument on these things. And I have real concerns about that. So I just wondered, like, what kind of conversations were happening within the left, like outside the Democratic Party in the States, on the question of Palestine. Because I saw on Al Jazeera that actually on election day, Israel demolished more Palestinian homes on that day than they had in the previous 10 years. So I think it's a key issue when it comes to international relations and imperialism, the relationship between the UK and the US, and also like the US adventures within the Middle East.
Yeah, I'm ashamed to say I didn't know that about the demolishing of the houses in Palestine on election day. It's like with the narcissism of U.S. elections, it was like that was the only thing that was happening in the world, which is of course ridiculous. So you know, I'm glad to learn, but sad to that's you know. I I think there's and I may be wrong on this, right? Because I think I mentioned I'm in the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and we have a long-standing commitment to solidarity with Palestine, and so I don't have a. I'm not sure if my orientation to what the rest of the left is doing is just like it may not be accurate, because it would my sense is like, oh, everybody's in favor of BDS, everybody,
Sure.
divestment sanctions. But when the last time I was in the UK and talking with a bunch of people, it did seem like the US left had an easier the U.S. left was more openly pro-Palestine and had a clearer pro-Palestine position than at least the left in England, because of the anti-Semitism problem and accusations, which is not in the U.S. mainstream it's used that way. But among the left, I don't think so. But again, that may be a little distorted because of where I'm coming from. I hope not.
No, I think that is true now, and I think that's sad because it very much wasn't true even a few years ago, which goes to show how effective these campaigns can be. I mean, there were reports out a few years ago where Israeli officials were saying we need to understand the British case study and stop it spreading, because in Britain, within about 10 years, British society had gone from basically completely uncritical of Israeli policies to huge demonstrations in support of the Palestinians, particularly from about 2009 with Operation Cast Lead. For years after that, there were massive demonstrations on Britain's streets. There was huge activity around BDS on campuses. And Israeli officials were saying, we need to do something about this because this could spread across Europe and then we're in real trouble. And it was bad enough that Britain, along with France, is probably like, the most important European ally of Israel. So it would become a real mess and a real problem. I remember thinking about the time of one of these huge demonstrations. It must have been about 2014 maybe, and there was a huge demonstration of about 500,000 people in London, looking at it and thinking, that's irreversible. Like you can't break that down. You can't beat that. This is like in Britain when anti-apartheid became a huge popular mood, and it totally left the kind of margins of the kind of far left and became a generally accepted political position among huge layers of society. A few years later, here we are, and yes, it's very evident that much fewer people want to talk about it because the campaign worked, basically. Yeah. The campaign terrified people and chased people away from the issue. And I also, tell me if I'm wrong about this, I've seen better solidarity from many quarters of the US left for Corbyn in particular than I've seen in parts of the Labour left. Which kind of shows you, that because there's a distance there, there's less of a kind of emotive terror, kind of around it. And there must be people in the international left looking at the situation saying, why are you letting your country's most famous socialist be destroyed like this? Why are you letting it happen?
Oh, absolutely, right. I mean, I got to say, I've actually been kind of shocked to not see more statements of solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn and utter condemnation of this expulsion. I mean, I found it like shocking, actually, when that's the kind of the reflex of hearing about it in the US has been, I mean, again, in the US left has been like, oh my God, this is terrible. How could this happen? Not, oh, well, there was a problem there. It's a good thing they're addressing it. Like, not even close.
So just to round up on our discussion, just sort of one last question, I think that feeds on from some of the other points that have already been made. Despite being backed by Wall Street, the 1%, the Economist, like all of those papers of financial and capital interests, Biden did not have a great campaign. Is he going to be a lame duck president? And if so, how do you think the left can intervene?
So I don't know what to predict about, what kind of president he will be, but I think you're absolutely right to say it's what matters is what the left does. And and I think on some parts of the left right now, there's a concern that, all of the liberal outrage that has been a big deal for the last 4 years, all of those folks are going to be like, okay, Trump's out, we're done, and they're going to go home. And frankly, I think that might be good because it's really made it it's clouded a lot of issues and made it very difficult to kind of push forward a more socialist consciousness, a more socialist orientation. Everything has been just about Trump. So it might seem like a little bit of a decline of energy for a bit, but what the left has to do is now hold Biden's feet to the fire. And this is going to be done in the ways that Bernie Sanders had always said that he was going to need to govern. And for him, it would be govern. With Biden, it will be the left opposition. And that's what the movement in the streets, right? We've got to, the left has got to be oriented around Medicare for all. I mean, it's ridiculous that we don't have a national health program. We've got to be oriented around the Green New Deal and climate change. I mean, I think everybody expects immediately Biden will get us right back into the Paris Climate Accord. The damn virus is still around, and we have no national level. There is no national level leadership or guidance or program or mandates or anything about that in the U.S. It's because of the federal system. Everything is done on a state and local level. So there needs to be guidance there. There needs to be the recognition that as this intensifies, there will be more shutdowns, and also people are coming up with having to pay their rents and mortgages. There should be no having to pay rents and mortgages. There needs to be the equivalent. I think I saw some finance numbers today that there needs to be something like $200 billion a month set aside by Congress for paying for people who are unemployed, furloughed, disadvantaged in whatever economic way because of the coronavirus, right? There needs to be a serious set of provision of measures taken to protect household and families, because we're going to face a massive wave of homelessness. So I think, and I think a movement that there's no way that the Democrats will pursue this without a hardcore movement in the street demanding it. And we absolutely have to do that.
Okay, Jodi, thanks very much for your thoughts. There are a lot to chew over, and
thanks.
As we say, by the time anyone's watching this, I dare say a lot of it will be out of date. So it would be good to get you back on at some point when we have a clearer picture of, what the new administration is going to be, whether or not Trump has been torn out of the White House, his fingernails digging in. So yeah, thanks very much for that.
Okay. And if weirdly in the next couple of days, like Trump wins, then I want to come right back on so we can redo this whole conversation. I mean, you can still broadcast it, edit whatever that, but I think we have to go back. Okay, well, now what?
Yeah, I might go for a sleep before we do that one though.
Yeah.
It's been very fun. I've enjoyed talking to y'all. Thank you.
It's been great. Thank you so much, Jodi.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.